Have you ever imagined being betrayed in the very place you trusted most? Have you ever thought about having your heart broken in the space that should be the safest for your faith, your family, and your soul? Well, my name is Mary Ellen Carter. I'm 67 years old, and today I'm going to open my heart to tell you about the most painful and transformative part of my life. It's not easy to revisit these memories, but I believe that by sharing what I experienced, I can reach women who may be going through something similar right now. Have you ever been there? Then stay with me until the end, because what I'm about to reveal may surprise you. I've always been a dedicated Christian woman. From a young age, I became involved with the church, immersed myself in the scriptures, and sought to be an example of faith, submission, and service. My life seemed to reflect what so many other women dream of: a solid marriage, a stable home, and a husband respected by the community. To everyone around us, we were the perfect couple. But behind the smiles lay a silence that weighed heavily on me. The silence of a woman who, even though she loved God, sensed something wrong growing within her home, but didn't dare question it. Have you ever felt suffocated by not being able to speak? Have you ever experienced that kind of pain that doesn't show itself in public, but consumes every prayer offered in secret? Well, that's exactly what I experienced. Little by little, I became aware of my husband's distancing, half-hearted apologies, and endless meetings. And while I prayed for clarity, the reality that awaited me was far crueler than I could have imagined. What you're about to discover may shake your view of trust, faith, and even the behind-the-scenes aspects of church life. Because the truth is, that night, when I walked down the stairs from the church's basement, my life changed forever. And it was exactly there, in the place where I had so often bent my knees to pray, that I encountered the scene that would become my greatest nightmare. In that instant, as my eyes fell upon the scene before me, I felt as if the ground had disappeared. My heart raced, my hands trembled, and it felt as if the air had become an unbearable weight within my chest. There, in the church basement, a space I associated with prayer, refuge, and encounter with God, I witnessed the most painful betrayal of my life. The man who had promised fidelity before the altar, who had preached so often about love and commitment, was silently destroying me. The hidden truth I so feared revealed itself without asking permission, and the perfect image everyone saw crumbled before my eyes. For a few seconds, I couldn't react. I felt as if my mind was torn between shock and denial. I asked myself, is this real? Is this happening to me? The woman with him looked at me with a mixture of shame and defiance, but none of that mattered, because the greatest pain wasn't in her. It was in him, in that face I knew so well, but which had suddenly become unrecognizable. That moment felt like an irreversible breach of trust, an impact that impacted not only my marriage, but also my faith, my self-esteem, and even my outlook on life. Behind the scenes at church, far from the eyes of the community, I discovered the price of the silence I'd carried for so many years. How many times had I swallowed my doubts? How many times had I hidden my tears behind polite smiles, believing that being submissive was synonymous with being a good wife? Now, this whole mindset seemed to have led me straight to the abyss. I didn't want to believe it, but it was impossible to ignore. The man everyone applauded on Sundays was destroying me from the shadows. And the hardest thing to accept is that when the truth came out, I found no support. Instead, I faced judgments, insinuations, and accusations that I might have failed in my role. It's strange how, in moments of pain, some people prefer to point fingers rather than extend a hand. I felt exposed, voiceless, as if my story were just another scandal to be whispered about. The abandonment didn't just happen within my home, but also in the heart of the community that was supposed to welcome me. Loneliness became my most constant companion. Many nights I cried in silence, believing I would never have the strength to rise again. I was gripped by a paralyzing fear that I would never be loved again, that I would never again have a place to belong. It was as if I had lost not only my husband, but also my identity, my place in the world, and even the sense of faith that had always sustained me. But even amidst the emptiness, something inside me began to stir, a small, almost imperceptible flame that reminded me that there was still life after the chaos. This experience, devastating as it was, also held the possibility of transformation. I didn't understand how, nor did I know when, but I began to realize that this was the beginning of a new journey, a journey of reconstruction, of decisions I never imagined making, of inner revelations that would forever change the way I saw myself and my relationship with God. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject. I grew up within the Christian faith. Since I was a little girl, my days were filled with services, hymns, and meetings that shaped my worldview. Church wasn't just a place I attended on Sundays, it was like an extension of my own home. I participated enthusiastically in ministries, helped with every event, prayed for the families in the community, and deeply believed that my life was being built as a living testimony of faithfulness. For me, being a woman of faith was more than a title. It was a calling, a responsibility that I took seriously. I was convinced that everything I did, every act of service, every personal sacrifice, was building a solid journey with God. I saw my dedication as an investment in the future, believing that the more I sowed in obedience, the more I would reap in blessings. And for a long time, I truly thought I was reaping. People looked to me as an example, saying I had a stable life, a structured family, and a marriage worthy of admiration. I believed that image reflected the truth, but behind the scenes, some cracks were beginning to appear. The mindset I carried back then was that a good wife should always remain silent in the face of difficulties. I believed that any conflict should be resolved with prayer and submission, never with confrontation. This belief led me to swallow many words, stifle feelings, and maintain a posture that, on the surface, portrayed me as virtuous, but which, in practice, was eroding my identity. I was praised for being patient and calm, but inside, there were often cries of pain that I dared not let out. This decision to remain silent, to hide my anguish, was one of the most difficult I've ever made, because, without realizing it, I allowed the small distances within my marriage to become abysses. I closed my eyes to the details that bothered me, convinced myself they were just phases, and clung to the hope that everything would go back to the way it was before. But the hidden truth is that I was merely sweeping reality under the rug, and each time I did so, the impact grew greater as it insisted on surfacing. I remember the first time I noticed changes in my husband's behavior. He, who had previously been so present, began to be absent due to ministry, commitments. He would arrive late, avoid long conversations, and use the church itself as an excuse to justify his absence. And I, with a mindset shaped by submission, accepted it without question. Deep down, something inside me screamed, but I preferred to believe it was just insecurity on my part. This journey of denial became increasingly painful, because the more I tried to keep up appearances, the more distant I became from myself. I didn't realize it, but I was losing my voice, my identity, and even the clarity to see what was happening before my eyes. It was as if I were living a story in which I had no right to be the protagonist. And it was precisely this stance, so praised from the outside, that ended up leaving me vulnerable to the hardest blow I would ever face. At every step of this journey, I believed I was being faithful to God, when in reality, I was only feeding the fear of being judged, rejected, and exposed. I thought my silence was synonymous with faith, but it was actually trapping me in a cycle of pain that only intensified. And when the truth finally revealed itself brutally, I realized how much all those silent choices had paved the way for the fall that was about to happen. My husband, at that time, was seen as a true pillar within the community, a respected deacon, admired by many, praised for his dedication and steadfastness. When he ascended the pulpit to pray, everyone listened in silence, some even with tears in their eyes. There was an aura around him, as if he were almost untouchable, someone above suspicion. For me, this was a source of pride, but also of security. I believed that, by his side, I was protected from any harm, that I had found not only a companion, but a safe haven. This image was cemented with every public gesture, with every sweet word before the church, and I clung to it like someone clinging to a promise of stability. Behind the scenes of our lives, however, the story was already beginning to unfold differently. There were times when I sensed a coldness disguised as fatigue, evasive answers that were always accompanied by justifications linked to the ministry. And how could I have suspected anything? He was the man everyone admired, the one who seemed to give his life for his faith. It was easier to believe I was exaggerating than to admit there was something wrong. This mindset of denial kept me blind, and, without realizing it, I myself contributed to sustaining the perfect image he projected. I saw him as a spiritual leader not only for the church, but for me as well. His opinions shaped my decisions, and I often failed to listen to my own intuition because I trusted his voice more than my own. It was as if he had gained authority not only at the altar, but within my soul. I confused submission with dependence, and this confusion caused me to give up essential parts of myself. I believed this surrender was proof of love, when in reality it was a blind surrender that would ultimately cost me dearly. The hidden truth, which I couldn't see at the time, is that people's admiration is no guarantee of character, and that the appearance of spirituality can hide deep flaws. But, immersed in that reality, I was unable to comprehend this. The impact of discovering this difference would come later, brutally, like a shock that would tear me from my naivete and make me see the shadows behind the brightness. It's painful to admit, but I harbored a kind of silent idolatry for that man. He was, for me, the embodiment of the stability I'd always sought, proof that my life of dedication to God was paying off. While everyone admired him, I believed I was privileged to be his wife. This belief made me proud, but it also imprisoned me because it made me ignore signs that an outsider might have seen more clearly. In the eyes of the community, I was the blessed woman, married to an example of faith. But behind the scenes, in the intimacy of my home, I began to feel the weight of being with someone who made me doubt myself. I justified his silences, accepted his absences, and hid my tears behind a mask of peace. I didn't want to admit that my safe haven was, in fact, already beginning to transform into an invisible prison. This contrast between his public image and his private reality was what struck me most, because, while everyone saw him as a man of unquestionable character, I was learning to cope with an ever-increasing emotional distance. And this silent, growing distance would be the beginning of a journey that would lead me to discoveries I never imagined I would face. Little by little, I began to understand that the perfect image everyone saw was merely a carefully constructed reflection, while inside my home I carried a burden I didn't have the courage to reveal to anyone. And it's precisely by opening up about this part of my story that I feel how important it is to create a space where women can recognize themselves, empower themselves, and not feel alone. So, if what I'm telling you here resonates with you, if this narrative somehow touches your life or awakens memories of your own journey, I want to ask you something very simple. Like this video. It may seem like a small detail, but the truth is that every like helps spread this message, gives more people access to stories that are often hidden behind the scenes, and allows this channel to continue growing as a space for support, reflection, and transformation. Your participation here isn't just a quick gesture on the screen. It's what gives me the strength to continue bringing profound stories, life revelations, and experiences that can impact so many other women who need to hear that they are not alone. It's as if every time you interact, you're also saying, "This voice matters. This story needs to be heard." And truly, that makes all the difference to those on this side opening their hearts. As I reflect on everything I experienced alongside that man, I remember how my trust was so firmly rooted in the image he projected that I didn't realize how much I was being undermined in the process. This emotional and spiritual dependence blinded me, and I couldn't see the cracks that were already slowly opening. It was as if I were living a play where everyone applauded the character, but backstage, I saw the flawed rehearsals and cold gestures that didn't match the role I was playing before the audience. And it was precisely this contradiction that began to awaken me to a reality I hadn't yet had the courage to face. In the eyes of the church, we were a model to be followed. My brothers and sisters looked at me with admiration, as if my life were the representation of a blessed marriage, proof that faith and dedication to Christian service truly bore fruit. We were called the perfect couple, always side by side in services, always smiling at gatherings, always ready to offer help when someone needed it. And I confess, for a long time, I let myself be lulled by this narrative, as if it were easier to believe the projected image than to face the hidden truth unfolding within my own home. However, behind that harmonious facade, I carried a weight no one could see. It was a silent, almost invisible burden, because I tried so hard to hide it. I was constantly afraid of disappointing, of being judged, of having my home compared to others. And this mindset forced me to maintain a mask every day, as if my smile were a shield against the distrust of those around me. But the impact of living this way was devastating. I began to believe I had no right to show fragility, that I should endure any pain in silence to keep up appearances. People praised our union, but they didn't know about the long nights I lay next to someone who was no longer present. They didn't know about the cold stares, the curt answers, and the distance that slowly grew, unnoticed. I was seen as a privileged wife, but inside, I felt loneliness eroding my faith. It was like living backstage at a play where the audience only applauded, but I knew every detail of the script's flaws. This contradiction suffocated me, because I couldn't share the truth with anyone. And when someone said to me, "You're lucky, Mary Ellen, your husband is a man of God," my heart sank even deeper. Because, silently, I wondered if it was truly luck or if I was trapped in a role I never chose. External expectations became an invisible prison, and I found myself increasingly alienated from myself. I convinced myself that it was part of the journey, that God had given me this cross to bear, and so I continued, bearing the weight of decisions that weren't mine, but which I accepted as inevitable. This contrast between what everyone saw and what I experienced wore me down deeply, because every compliment I received felt like confirmation that I should remain silent, that showing the truth would be a betrayal not only to my husband, but to the community itself. I was trapped in a web of expectations and judgments that prevented me from being true. And the most painful thing was that deep down, I no longer knew who I was without that mask. It was as if my life had become a stage where every gesture had to be measured, every word calculated, every action controlled, so that the image of perfection wouldn't be tarnished. But behind this performance, I felt my soul crying out for authenticity, for freedom, for a chance to breathe without fear of discovery. I knew something needed to change, but I didn't have the courage to face the consequences of tearing away the veil that covered my reality. And it was precisely in this silence that the cracks began to deepen, until nothing could be hidden anymore. As time passed, the small signs began to accumulate, and even though I tried to ignore them, it was impossible not to feel the weight of the changes. He, who always arrived with me at services and made a point of remaining by my side during every activity, began to withdraw with the excuse of ministry commitments. The meetings that were once quick and to the point began to stretch late into the night. I found myself walking home alone, Bible still in hand, trying to convince myself that this was part of the routine of a man so involved in God's work. But inside, something ached. It was as if my heart was alerting me to a hidden truth I didn't want to see. I felt the impact of this distance in every detail. Conversations, which once flowed naturally, were now silent. Meals, which used to be moments of sharing, were left with only the sound of silverware and an invisible wall between us. Even the simplest gestures, like a look or a touch, held a void that hurt. The mindset I carried told me I should accept it, that a man dedicated to the church had his responsibilities, and that my role was to be patient and understanding. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just that. It was as if a part of him was already gone, though his body was still present. There were long nights of waiting, where I lay in bed not knowing when he would return, and when he did, he came with well-rehearsed excuses, stories about meetings, visits, and tasks that required his presence. I wanted to believe, but the coldness in his gaze betrayed something was wrong. I swallowed the lump in my throat, smiled in front of people, and continued to maintain the perfect image of marriage, while inside me a silent battle raged. I fought against distrust, against the fear of imagining things, but also against the anguish of realizing that the relationship was no longer the same. Behind the scenes of our lives, distance was becoming invisible walls. Intimacy was slowly dissolving, and I felt my attempts to reconnect were being lost in the void. It was like trying to hold water between my fingers. The harder I tried, the faster it slipped away. His decisions to be absent were shaping a new landscape for us, and I, without realizing it, was adapting to living in a cold home, where physical presence didn't mean real closeness. I kept quiet because I believed that complaining would be a lack of faith, that confronting someone would be disrespectful to the man everyone admired. This silence consumed me, like a poison that builds slowly, without giving immediate signs, but that corrodes from within. And while I insisted on believing it was just a phase, the distance became a new routine. I no longer had a companion, but a stranger who shared the same house with me. This period was one of the most painful phases of my journey, because I still tried to cling to the hope that everything would return to normal. I prayed, fasted, and asked God to restore love, to rekindle what seemed to have faded. But each day, instead of answers, I received more silence. His silence, my own silence, and the heavy silence that hung over our relationship. And it was in this emptiness that the truth began to form, ready to reveal itself in an even more cruel way. Back then, being a woman in the church meant carrying a burden that went beyond the responsibilities of home or ministry. There was an ingrained mindset that silence was the greatest feminine virtue, as if enduring without question was proof of faith. I was taught from a young age to believe that any pain could be overcome through prayer, that every wound would heal with submission, and that raising my voice against my husband was a sign of rebellion against God. This belief shaped my decisions for years, and prevented me from realizing that often I wasn't being submissive out of love, but rather nullified by the fear of not being accepted. I remember the conversations between women at the end of services, always filled with phrases repeated like a mantra. Pray for your husband. Have patience. Be wise and keep quiet. I absorbed it as if it were an absolute truth, believing my mission was to endure in silence while he remained distant and cold. I kept quiet not because it didn't hurt, but because I feared judgment. I knew that if I dared to question it, I would be seen as ungrateful, as someone who didn't appreciate the exemplary husband everyone admired. It was as if there were an invisible barrier separating me from the freedom to express my own pain. This silence became part of my daily life. I would choke back tears in the wee hours of the morning and rise early with a practiced smile for the community. I would kneel to pray for transformation, believing my silence would be rewarded with a revelation or a miracle that would restore our marriage. But as I waited for divine intervention, the impact of this silence built up inside me. It was like a locked box, full of feelings I couldn't reveal to anyone: frustration, loneliness, anguish, and a suffocating sense of worthlessness. The most painful thing was that the more I remained silent, the more isolated I felt. Because while I maintained the image of a strong and faithful woman, I was consumed by the feeling of invisibility. Each day, it felt like I was losing a piece of my identity, as if my own voice were disappearing. And what I didn't realize was that this absence of voice was opening the way for something even more cruel. The hidden truth, hiding behind the discourse of obedience, was that I was slowly being silenced, not only as a wife, but as a woman. Behind the scenes of my heart, there was a constant conflict. On one side, faith told me to remain steadfast. On the other, intuition screamed at me not to accept that emptiness as normal. This internal struggle tore me apart, because I wanted to believe that prayer would be enough, but I also felt like I was losing myself by accepting indifference as part of life. The impact of this choice was profound. My self-confidence weakened, and I began to believe I had no right to expect more than what I was receiving. And it was precisely in this state of silence and submission that I found myself increasingly vulnerable. Every unquestioned gesture, every swallowed word, every night of solitude became like bricks building a wall between us. I didn't know it, but that wall was about to shatter brutally, revealing a reality that would change my story forever. That night, something inside me burned like a flame I couldn't ignore. It was late. The service had already ended, and as usual, he had said he would stay at the church a little longer to take care of some ministry matters. I tried to convince myself it was just another one of his meetings, but there was a strange weight on my heart, a nagging feeling that wouldn't leave me alone. It was as if a silent voice was telling me I needed to go after him, that there was something that couldn't wait until the next morning. I grabbed my bag and walked to the church, and as I entered, the silence of the temple seemed to watch me. Every step I took echoed in the empty hallways, and my heart pounded so hard I felt like I could hear the rush of blood inside me. I descended the stairs that led to the basement, a place where I had knelt so often to pray, where so many vigils of faith had taken place. But that night, that sacred space was about to become the scene of my worst nightmare. When I reached the door, I hesitated. My hand trembled before I even touched the handle, as if my body already knew the hidden truth about to be revealed. I opened it slowly, and the scene before me was a blow that pierced my soul in a way no words can describe. There he was, the man who had promised fidelity before God, involved with another woman. There was no excuse, no other interpretation. It was betrayal, naked and raw, in the place where we so often preach about holiness and commitment. In that instant, the impact was so devastating that I felt as if all the air had been knocked out of me. My legs weakened, my vision blurred, and for a few seconds I wondered if it was a bad dream from which I would soon wake. But it wasn't. It was real, painfully real. He saw me, his eyes met mine, and in that look there was no immediate regret, not even a hint of shame. It was as if the entire mask had fallen away, revealing a man I no longer recognized. The woman beside me seemed torn between guilt and defiance. I, in shock, couldn't utter a word. I only felt a pent-up scream inside me, a plea for help that wouldn't come out of my throat. It was then that I realized my life would never be the same. The church basement, a place that had so often represented solace and spiritual transformation, had become the stage for the cruelest revelation of my journey. I walked home that night as if floating in a void. Every step was heavy, every thought a whirlwind. I asked myself, how can this be? How can someone who claims to be a servant of God live such a huge lie? I had no answers, only the throbbing pain of an open wound. And as the hours passed, a new reality began to form within me. I understood that it wasn't just a man's betrayal, but the shattering of the entire structure I had trusted. It was as if a veil had been torn before my eyes, forcing me to see not only his infidelity, but also the silence I had accepted for so many years. And this revelation, painful as it was, would be only the beginning of an even deeper transformation. It was as if my heart had been ripped from my chest and crushed before my eyes. That basement, which had so often been my refuge of prayer, a place where I shed tears before God asking for answers and surrendering dreams, suddenly became the most terrifying scene of my life. Every corner, every wall, seemed to mock my pain, as if the memories of faith and hope had been stained by a scene I could never erase from my memory. The space that should have carried God's presence was now imbued with the weight of betrayal. My knees weakened, and I felt my entire body tremble, as if my strength had been drained away all at once. The silence of that moment was deafening, because within me was a pent-up scream, a mixture of disbelief and despair. How could something so unthinkable be happening right there, in the house I so honored? The impact was so profound it seemed beyond words. It was as if a part of me had died at that very moment, leaving behind only the shards of a woman who no longer knew who she was. He looked at me, and there was no immediate remorse in his gaze, only a cold discomfort, like someone caught in a hidden truth that had been brewing for a long time. This revelation was an even greater blow, because I realized it wasn't a momentary slip-up, but a choice, a secret decision, a performance played out in front of everyone. I, who had always believed that the truth sets you free, was now faced with proof that lies can imprison and wound in ways that leave deep scars. The shock was accompanied by a sense of loss that transcended the marriage. I lost trust, lost peace, lost the certainty that I was safe in the place I had always considered sacred. My mind whirled between memories of prayers said in that very basement and the scene that now burned into my eyes. It was such a stark contrast that it felt like torture. That space, which once represented my intimacy with God, now reminded me of the falsehood hidden behind the scenes of a relationship I had believed to be solid. I left there staggering, as if carrying an invisible weight threatening to crush my shoulders. Each step was accompanied by tears I couldn't hold back, and the feeling that the world around me had crumbled all at once. I didn't know how to move forward, but I knew nothing would ever be the same. The shock of that night sapped my strength, but it also planted a painful certainty within me. I could no longer live in illusion. And even though I wasn't clear on how, this discovery would be the starting point for a journey of revelations that would forever change my story. When the truth finally came out, I believed, deep down, that I would find some kind of support, a shoulder to cry on, someone who would say, "You are not alone." But what I found was completely the opposite. Instead of comfort, I received sidelong glances, whispers in hallways, and judgmental remarks that still echo in my memory. They said I hadn't been a good wife, that perhaps I had failed in my role, that my silence was actually a sign of carelessness. It was as if the blame for the betrayal I had suffered had been placed on me. I wondered, how could a community that preaches love, acceptance, and empathy become such a cold court? It felt like being stoned in a public square, but with invisible stones made of harsh words and veiled rejection. The emotional impact of this rejection was as profound as the betrayal itself, because if the attack in the church basement destroyed my trust in my husband, the community's judgments destroyed part of my trust in the church itself. It was as if people needed to find someone to blame for what had happened, and it was easier to blame myself than to face the hidden truth that the man everyone admired was living a lie. I began to realize that behind the smiles and public prayers, there was a cruel mentality that women should always bear the brunt of the blame, no matter the circumstances. It was easier to say I hadn't prayed enough, that I hadn't been patient enough, that I hadn't fulfilled my role with excellence. No one asked about my pain. No one wanted to know what I'd seen with my own eyes. The behind-the-scenes nature of that community proved different from what I'd believed, demonstrating that often religiosity is used as a mask to cover up a lack of compassion. This collective judgment made me feel even more alone. Not only had I lost my husband to lies, but I also felt expelled from the very support network I always thought I had. Walking down the aisles of the church became a burden, because every glance carried innuendo. Every conversation seemed to hide my name in whispers. I, who had always believed faith was a place of refuge, was discovering that it could become a space of exile when the narrative didn't match people's expectations. It was during this period that I realized something painful but essential. The opinions of others can be as destructive as the actions of the betrayer. I needed to somehow choose between continuing to wallow in this cycle of guilt that wasn't mine, or finding a way to rise up despite the accusations. This was the first time I understood that my journey of transformation couldn't depend on everyone's support, but on the internal decision to free myself from what didn't belong to me. And even though this awareness didn't bring me immediate peace, it was at that point that I began to see that the real battle wasn't just against the pain of betrayal, but against the prison of words and judgments that tried to define me. He didn't just betray me, he left me. The man who once swore fidelity before God and man chose the cruelest path, turning his back, abandoning not only his wife but also the history we had built together, leaving me exposed to the scorn of a community that no longer saw me as a victim, but as guilty. The abandonment wasn't just physical, it was emotional, spiritual, and social. It was as if I had suddenly been ripped from my position as an honorable wife to occupy the place of a marked woman, carrying a stigma that seemed to cling to my skin. I remember walking the streets and feeling the eyes on me, as if everyone knew, as if every whisper was about my failure, about what I couldn't bear. It felt like living in a defenseless courtroom, where everyone had the right to judge me without knowing the behind-the-scenes of my pain. This impact was so profound that it robbed me of my voice. I no longer had the strength to explain myself, and perhaps it wouldn't have been any use, because for many, I had already been condemned. Inside the house, the emptiness was even more deafening. Every object held memories. Every corner reminded me of his presence, which was now merely an absence. The bed seemed larger, the dining table colder, and even prayers became difficult to say. I felt as if I had lost not only my husband, but also the ground I walked on. It was as if abandonment had opened a hole beneath my feet, and I was free-falling, unsure if I would ever find my feet again. Behind the scenes of my soul, a silent war raged. Part of me still searched for answers, still yearned to understand how someone capable of preaching about love could be so ruthless. Another part tried to accept that perhaps there would never be a sufficient explanation, that some hidden truths simply destroy without leaving room for justification. And amidst this internal chaos, I had to decide whether to continue letting myself wither away or to seek some shred of strength to move forward. Abandonment forced me to face an unexpected transformation. I realized that if I remained trapped in the guilt-ridden mindset imposed on me, I would only be fueling the invisible prison I already lived in. This revelation didn't happen immediately, but with each tear I shed, I began to realize that, even in the darkness, there was a seed of resistance trying to sprout. It was as if my journey had reached its lowest point so I could finally understand the value of rebuilding. And so, through tears and sleepless nights, I discovered that abandonment, devastating as it was, wouldn't have the final word on me. It had exposed me to judgment, but at the same time, it was paving the way for a new awareness, a transformation that was just beginning. At 45, I found myself completely alone, as if my entire history had been ripped from me at once. It was a deep, dense loneliness, not just about the absence of someone by my side, but about the feeling of having lost who I was. Abandonment didn't just leave a void in my home, it also left a void within me. I looked in the mirror and no longer recognized the woman reflected there. Where was the respected wife? Where was the faithful servant everyone admired? What remained was only a shadow, marked by pain, shame, and a constant sense of failure. Being a woman at that stage of life already carried with it many expectations. I was supposed to be mature, stable, an example of faith. But in practice, I felt shattered into 1,000 pieces. The identity I had built over the years seemed to have disappeared along with it. I no longer knew how to present myself to others, nor how to present myself before God. I felt a mixture of fear and disbelief, as if with every prayer I asked, "Lord, what is left of me now?" This loneliness had a silent but devastating impact. I felt invisible, as if my worth had been lost along with marriage. At church gatherings, I no longer fit in. Married women regarded me with a certain distance, as if I were an uncomfortable reminder that not all homes are perfect. Single women didn't know how to approach me, because I wasn't one of them. And men, many avoided contact, as if my condition were a contagious stain. The hidden truth is that loneliness wasn't limited to the four walls of my home. It accompanied me into every space I occupied, and in the silence of the days and nights, I began to realize how much I had lost myself. I had lived so long to uphold the image of a faithful and submissive wife that I no longer knew what my own desires, my wishes, my choices were. My entire life had revolved around a man who no longer existed in my reality. And what remained was a frightening void, a journey I didn't know if I had the strength to begin. At the same time, this loneliness began to confront me in an unexpected way. With no one left to hide my pain, I was forced to face my own wounds. I understood that I was facing a crucial decision: continue sinking into the darkness of rejection, or try, even if staggering, to find a path to reconstruction. It was a painful invitation to transformation, but also inevitable, because deep down, I knew that if I didn't seek a new mindset, loneliness would swallow me whole. And it was in this internal confrontation that I realized that solitude, however cruel, could also become a space for revelation. It wasn't just absence, it was also a chance to rediscover who I truly was, without the masks, without the imposed roles, without the need to please everyone. This discovery didn't happen overnight, but it was the first step in a long journey that was just beginning. For years, shame was like an invisible chain that held me captive. I walked, smiled, and even participated in activities, but inside I carried an unbearable weight. It was as if every look I received reminded me of a guilt that wasn't mine, but which I accepted as if it were. Silence became my refuge and, at the same time, my prison. I didn't talk about what had happened because I was afraid of being judged again, afraid of seeing in people's eyes confirmation of what I already secretly believed, that I wasn't enough. This silence cruelly shaped my mindset. I'd grown accustomed to holding back words, swallowing my pain, hiding my tears so as not to appear weak. But in reality, this attempt to appear strong only made me even more fragile inside. Every time someone asked me how I was, and I responded with fine, I felt like I was betraying myself, because nothing was fine. The hidden truth was that I was afraid to expose my wounds and find no compassion, only more stones thrown. And the most painful thing was that, even alone, I repeated the voices that condemned me. It was as if the community had left an echo within me. I looked in the mirror and, instead of seeing a woman who survived, I saw someone broken, scarred, unable to rise again. And so the silence corroded my identity until I myself began to believe the lies that surrounded me. It wasn't just shame for what had happened. It was as if I was ashamed of existing, of taking up space, of having failed at something that, deep down, was never within my control. This process of hiding my pain has caused me to miss precious moments of my own journey. How many times have I wanted to open my mouth and scream everything that was holding me back, but I kept quiet out of fear? How many times have I sat alone, wishing someone would see past my fake smile and no one noticed? The impact of silence is devastating because it creates a barrier between who you are and who you show the world. And I became an expert at disguise, carrying behind the scenes, a story I didn't have the courage to tell. But as suffocating as the silence was, it also began to show me something I hadn't expected. Little by little, I realized that hiding the pain didn't make it disappear. On the contrary, it grew, becoming a greater burden, demanding to be faced. And almost imperceptibly, a need to break free from that prison began to grow within me, because there was something inside me that still pulsed, something I wouldn't accept being reduced to shame. This spark, still timid, was what made me realize I needed to face my own story head-on, without filters, without masks, without fear of judgment. There were nights when the silence seemed heavier than any words that could be spoken. I would lie in bed, staring at the dark ceiling, tears streaming down my face, unable to contain them. It was in this space of solitude that my voice rose in prayer, but not a serene prayer, the kind that arises from a grateful heart. It was a plea filled with pain, a harsh conversation, almost an accusation. Lord, why did you allow this to happen to me? I didn't want theological answers. I wasn't seeking cold explanations. What I wanted was a comforting embrace, a sign that I hadn't been forgotten. And the most intense thing is that this struggle wasn't just with God, but with myself. I wavered between believing He still had a plan and suspecting He had abandoned me. With each memory, each judgment, each silence that suffocated me, I found myself further away from what I once called unshakable faith. The hidden truth that few admit is that faith also passes through deserts, and that in these deserts, the heart cries out things I would never dare say aloud in a church. I discovered that trusting in God isn't about living without doubts, but about having the courage to bring those doubts to Him, even if my voice is choked with tears. In these moments of confrontation, I realized something striking. It was as if He bore the weight of my questions, without taking offense, as if He knew my weaknesses before I even voiced them. This didn't erase my pain, but it made me realize there was room for it. And it was in this space that something slowly began to change. Because if I had the strength to question, I also had the strength to remain, even though wounded. This mentality that faith only exists when everything is going well is an illusion. True faith reveals itself precisely when nothing seems to make sense. I don't romanticize those nights. They were hard, heavy, and filled with anger. But paradoxically, they were also nights when I experienced the most sincere vulnerability before God, as if there, behind the scenes of my pain, there was a silent revelation. He didn't see me as someone marked by shame, but as a daughter who could still be restored. This realization didn't come all at once. It wasn't like a flash that changes everything in seconds. It was slow, almost imperceptible, but real. A transformation that began when I understood that I didn't need to hide my questions, because even they could be a path to encounter. And so, through tears and broken prayers, I realized that the true miracle wasn't seeing my pain suddenly disappear, but finding the courage to carry on, even when nothing seemed fair. And it was in this quiet courage that I began to see that my journey wasn't over yet. The fear of starting over is an invisible yet suffocating prison. I felt surrounded by walls that didn't really exist, but that seemed more solid than any concrete. The betrayal had already hurt me, but what paralyzed me was the shadow it left, the idea that I might never be loved again, that I would never again have a safe space to rest my soul. It wasn't just about losing a relationship, it was about losing a sense of belonging, as if I'd been ripped from a place and left without ground, without identity, without a harbor. This feeling seeped into the little things of everyday life, in the conversations I avoided, the celebrations I withdrew from, as if my name was forever marked by a scar that everyone could see, even when I tried to hide it. It's strange how the mind, when wounded, creates hidden truths that don't exist. I believed the rejection I'd received was final, that it would be impossible to find space in a world that judged and labeled me. And this thought corroded my courage, like a silent poison that made me believe any attempt at a fresh start would be certain failure. I no longer saw my own qualities, my strength, or my faith. Everything seemed erased by the lens of insecurity. This mentality made me believe it was better to keep quiet, not take risks, not try again, as if the protection against new wounds lay in hiding myself from any possibility of life. But the truth is that fear, when left unaddressed, secretly shapes our decisions. I realized it was present even in my dreams, when I would wake with my heart racing and an emptiness difficult to explain. The impact wasn't just emotional, it was physical, spiritual, as if my very energy had been drained. The profound loneliness transformed into an internal echo that repeated, "You will no longer be chosen." And I believed it. Until, behind the scenes of my pain, a seed began to germinate. What if this voice was lying? What if this fear was merely a shadow cast by wounds, but not the ultimate reality of my journey? This thought was still fragile, barely a whisper, but it was enough to break, even if only, discreetly, the grip of dread. Because deep down, I knew that starting over wasn't about being accepted by others again, but about accepting myself first, about allowing myself to see that someone's rejection doesn't define my worth. This kind of revelation doesn't happen spectacularly, but rather as a slow awakening, a silent transformation that gradually opens up space within us. And it was in this process that I began to understand that, behind the fear, there was a new opportunity hidden, just waiting for the right moment to be experienced. It was at this point in my journey that something within me began to shift, silently but powerfully. Until then, I had placed most of my trust in others, in the husband who swore eternal love, in the community I believed would be there for me, in the people who seemed like firm pillars but who, at the first gust of wind, vanished. It was as if my entire identity had been built on fragile foundations, sustained by external gaze and the recognition I sought outside myself. But when those pillars crumbled, and I was left standing with only my own fragments, I realized something that had always been before me, but which I had never seen so clearly. My faith was not in men, it was in Christ. He never betrayed me, never left me, never shamed me. This revelation didn't come like a bolt of lightning in the middle of the night, but like a steady breath that gradually warmed my heart. It was in solitude that I understood a presence that had never abandoned me, even when I couldn't love myself. In every tear I shed alone, there was a silent certainty that I wasn't invisible in his eyes. I had confused faith with institutions, with people, with rituals. But true faith isn't an external structure. It's an intimate, personal, non-transferable encounter. And it was in this encounter that I discovered a strength that no longer depended on anyone's approval. It's curious how, when everything is taken away from us, we begin to see what truly matters. And it was in this emptiness that I found fulfillment. Not a fulfillment of answers, but of presence. It wasn't about understanding why it had happened, but about trusting that, even in the chaos, there was purpose. This shift in mindset was like crossing a threshold. The fear that had paralyzed me began to lose ground, and in its place was born a hope that couldn't be explained by logic, but by faith. It was as if, for the first time, I had stopped looking behind the scenes at what went wrong and started contemplating the stage of what was being prepared for me. And this realization was liberating, because I understood that men fail, that institutions falter, that oaths can be broken, but Christ's faithfulness remains immutable. This is the hidden truth we so often fail to perceive because we're too busy trying to maintain control of our lives. I myself spent years believing that my security lay in keeping up appearances, in being the exemplary wife, the devoted woman, the irreproachable Christian. But when all that was stripped away, he showed me that my identity lay not in labels, but in his love. From that revelation on, my days began to take on a new meaning. Not that the pain suddenly disappeared, because it didn't. The wound still hurt, the memories still brought tears, but there was no longer any despair. There was a calm certainty, like someone finding shelter in the midst of a storm. And in that shelter, I could rest without having to prove anything to anyone. For the first time in a long time, I felt I didn't need to justify myself. I didn't need to explain myself. I didn't need to beg for love. I was already loved, and that love was enough. It's at this point in the journey that true transformation happens. Not because someone came to rescue me, but because I discovered there had been a savior by my side all along. Not because circumstances changed, but because my perception changed. This is the difference between surviving and living. Surviving is simply resisting the impact of pain. Living is choosing, even when wounded, to move forward to something greater. And when this clarity settled within me, I realized that starting over was no longer a threat, but a promise. It wasn't about returning to who I was before, but about allowing God to make me new, with an identity that didn't depend on human failings, but on the perfection of his love. That was the moment I stopped seeing betrayal as the end and began to see it as the door to a new stage in my journey. Gradually, the tears gave way to an unexpected courage, as if I were being led to ground I had never before tread, but which felt somehow safe, because now I no longer walked alone, nor did I seek in others the validation that only he could give me. And that was how I realized that a true encounter with faith is not a one-off event, but an ongoing process of surrender, trust, and transformation that prepares us for steps that once seemed impossible, but which now become not only possible, but inevitable. When this awakening happened within me, one of the greatest revelations was realizing that my pain didn't have to be in vain. Until then, I believed that everything I'd experienced was just a burden, a mark I should carry in silence, like someone trying to hide a scar so no one notices. But it was in the process of rediscovering faith that I realized something greater. My story, however painful, had power. Not just power over me, but over others. I finally understood that my suffering could become a voice for so many women who still live imprisoned in silence, hiding their wounds behind practiced smiles. This was a turning point, because until then, my biggest concern was surviving the pain. But suddenly I realized I could go beyond that I could transform this desert into a path of transformation. What had previously seemed merely shame began to become a flag. I no longer saw my scars as signs of failure, but as proof of resilience. It was as if every tear I shed had been collected and transformed into a source of empathy, something capable of reaching other lives. And it is at this moment that the journey takes on a new dimension, when pain ceases to be merely personal and becomes a bridge that connects stories, that generates identification, that inspires courage. I've discovered that there's a profound impact when someone has the audacity to break the silence. There's a hidden truth so many women carry, that they believe they're the only ones experiencing certain pains, and it's this isolation that keeps so many trapped, believing there's no way out. When a voice rises and says, "I know how you feel, because I've been there too," something changes. The weight no longer seems so unbearable, the darkness no longer so dense, the loneliness no longer so absolute. Testimony has the power to break down invisible barriers, to open breaches in walls of silence. And it was in this process that I realized the responsibility that came with healing. Because it wasn't just about getting up, but about reaching out. It was as if God was showing me that nothing I had faced had been wasted. Every night of crying, every unanswered prayer, every painful doubt, all of it would be used so that others could find courage. This is the power of witnessing, transforming wounds into seeds, pain into messages, personal stories into collective bridges. I never imagined that the thing I most wanted to hide would one day be precisely what would give me authority over other women. Authority not in the sense of commanding, but in the sense of inspiring, of showing that there is life after a fall, that there is a new beginning after betrayal, that there is dignity even after humiliation. And this is a powerful mindset shift, because it removes us from the position of victim and places us in the position of protagonists of our own journey. What was once just pain now became a tool. What once silenced me now compelled me to speak out. It's not easy to take this stance because there's always the risk of judgment. Society often prefers that a woman who has been hurt remain silent, as if her voice were too uncomfortable. But it was precisely at this point that I realized my decision had to be greater than my fear. Because every time I remained silent, I reinforced the idea that the pain was shameful, when in fact it could be liberating if exposed. This is what testimony is. A key that opens doors not only for the speaker, but also for the listener. And when that key turns, everything around begins to change. Because bearing witness isn't just about narrating facts. It's about revealing behind-the-scenes details that few have the courage to reveal. It's about opening up space for revelations that challenge the status quo, that expose hidden truths that many people prefer to keep hidden. And in doing so, we create an invisible network of women who, even without knowing each other, begin to feel part of the same struggle, the same journey of reconstruction. It was then that I realized there was no turning back. Once the voice finds its strength, there is no longer room for silence. And the more I spoke, the more I understood that my testimony wasn't just about me, but about all those who never had the courage to tell their own story. It was as if my life became a channel, and through it, other lives could see that there is still hope, that there is still a possible path, even when all seems lost. This awareness brought a new sense of purpose, something I had never experienced before. It was no longer about what I had lost, but about what I could offer. It was no longer about the impact of pain on me, but about the impact of my voice on others. And it showed me that the true value of a testimony lies not in the perfection of the narrative, but in the authenticity of the one who shares it. You don't need to have all the answers, nor have overcome everything. Just be real, be honest, be human. And the more I embraced this truth, the clearer it became that this journey wasn't just about survival, but about legacy. Because bearing witness is planting seeds in soil that I may never see blossom, but that will certainly bear fruit in someone's life. It's an act of faith, an act of courage, an act of love. And that's how I understood that my pain, which once seemed only destruction, was now also construction. This is the point at which the wound becomes a scar, and the scar becomes a message. And every time I share this message, I feel that it is not just mine, but ours. Because vulnerability, when exposed with courage, ceases to be weakness and becomes a collective strength. And it is in this movement that something even greater begins, one that goes beyond my own story, opening space for new revelations that continue to unfold throughout the journey. How many times have you wondered how many women around you carry pain hidden behind a seemingly firm gaze? The hidden truth is that many live trapped in imposed silences, afraid to expose their wounds, as if doing so would diminish who they are. Perhaps you yourself, on the other side, know this weight well, this feeling of being trapped between the desire for liberation and the fear of judgment. It is at this point that the journey takes on an even greater impact, because we are not just talking about individual stories, but about a collective transformation that arises when someone decides to break this cycle. Each voice that rises carries with it a strength capable of paving the way for so many others. And it is in this movement that faith finds its most vivid expression, behind the scenes of real life, in the everyday where decisions and small choices change entire destinies. And it is precisely here that I want to extend a sincere invitation. If this story spoke to you, if it somehow touched your soul or brought revelations about your own journey, leave a comment, like this video, and subscribe to the channel. Your participation is not just a symbolic gesture, but part of this wave of hope that reaches more and more women. Together, we can transform silence into voice, pain into testimony, and fear into courage.